So we'll start now. And again, I just want to welcome everyone, a very, very warm welcome to you all. I'm Cynthia Lazaroff, and I welcome you from the land I'm honored to steward here on the island of Kauai, below the sacred mountain Kalalea. As my beloved teacher, Kumu Hula Puna Dawson says, the prayer bowl, the place where all the souls enter the earth. Thank you, each and every one of you who are joining us across many time zones around the world for this very special program on pathways to peace and denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. As of this morning, of a few minutes ago, we have over 100 people registered for this session from 16 countries, including 5 of the nuclear armed states, Russia, the United States, India, Great Britain, and Israel. And we're honored to have with us 3 extraordinary mentors today, Christine Ahn, Jessica Lee, and Dr. Kalamaoka'aina Niheu. These women are all dedicated to transforming our nuclear legacy, all leading in new ways, all showing us a pathway forward to peace in Korea and beyond. I want to express my gratitude to the Plowshares Fund Women's Initiative for their generous support in making this program possible. Plowshares has been leading the quest to eliminate nuclear weapons since they got started 40 years ago. And Plowshares founder, Sally Lilienthal, dedicated her life and heart and soul to this. We wouldn't be here without Sally, and we wouldn't be here without Plowshares. We've chosen today for this gathering with intention, still in the blessed light of yesterday's summer solstice, the day of longest light, to honor Christine, Kalama, and Jessica for shining the light for peace in Korea, to learn and discover ways we can join them. May the light for peace grow brighter and brighter. May it be so. Now I'd like to welcome my dear friend and teacher, beloved elder in our community here on the island of Kauai, Kumu Hula Puna Dawson, who will open our session with a blessing for peace. Puna shares the spirit of aloha wherever she goes. She travels the world sharing aloha, building bridges for peace between the peoples of the Hawaiian Islands and the peoples of the world. Aloha and welcome, dear Auntie Puna. Mahalo for being here with us. We're so happy to have you here. We welcome you to share your blessing now.
Aloha, everyone. You see me with earphones because I don't want to miss anything that's being said by all of you. But let's just take this time to breathe into our hands and offer this breath so that all of our families are now talking to one another and finding all the things that are very familiar about each other. You know, when you step into a room and you look around and you see family members there, that's the first thing you do. Oh, aren't you my auntie's sister's cousin's niece? You're related to me somehow, right? It's about relationship. And one thing that I want to say that we all share is this breath of aloha, this breath of life. And so we as a people of this earth, we are responsible for one another. And that is the ha. We come from the birth waters of our mothers, and that is a way. And that iona lani is that universal good. So I'm so happy to be witness to everyone and the blessings that we all bring by coming together and sharing our ike, sharing our mana, sharing our knowledge in all these things we say with kindness, with graciousness, with thoughtfulness, the appreciation of diversity and the difference in all these things we say. Aloha, come share my space, come share my time, come share and let us care for our earth. Aloha, everyone.
Mahalo ni
Mahalo.
loa. Mahalo ni loa, Auntie, for that beautiful blessing, and may it be so. May aloha, the spirit of aloha, be shared and welcomed everywhere. So at a time when US former Secretary of Defense William Perry says that we're at a greater risk of a nuclear catastrophe than during the Cold War, we're gathered today to learn about one of the places where Secretary Perry and many top experts are most concerned about the risk of a nuclear confrontation, the Korean Peninsula, what the stakes are, the human costs, and the pathways forward to peace and denuclearization. This week, June 25th, will mark the 71st anniversary of the official start of the Korean War, the United States' longest forever war. Most Americans not only don't remember this war, but have no idea that this war never formally came to an end. A peace agreement was never signed, and as we will hear today, peace is a precondition for denuclearization. Since the dawn of the nuclear age, women have been largely shut out of nuclear policymaking. Today, women are still grossly underrepresented in nuclear policy, negotiations, and peace-building processes. And yet when women are involved, the research shows peace becomes more possible and peace agreements more enduring. Excluding women, half of the human race for much of the nuclear age has brought us to the brink of possible extinction. Best-selling author Elizabeth Lesser has come out with a compelling new book, Cassandra Speaks: When Women Are the Storytellers, the Human Story Changes. We're here today because it's an existential imperative that we write a new story on the Korean Peninsula. We're going to hear now from our three path-breaking women peace builders who are all doing just that, each in her own way, writing and living a new story, awakening us, inspiring us, showing us the way forward to bring healing, peace, and the elimination of nuclear weapons on the Korean Peninsula. These women are welcoming us, inviting us to join them, roll up our sleeves, get to work, and get this done. There's not a moment to spare. So with that, it's my great honor to welcome our mentors. And I'd like to begin with you, Christine. Christine Ahn is the founder and executive director of Women Cross DMZ, a global movement of women mobilizing to end the Korean War and ensure women's leadership in peace building. In 2015, she led 30 international women peacemakers across the DMZ from North Korea to South Korea. They walked with 10,000 Korean women on both sides of the DMZ and held women's peace symposia in Pyongyang and Seoul. She is the recipient of the 2020 U.S. Peace Prize for her bold activism to end the Korean War, heal the wounds from war, and for women's leadership in peace building. Christine, in the short time that I've known you, which is now just over a year, you have literally changed my life. You've had a huge impact on my life and work. You inspire me every day with your courage, your dedication, your leadership, and your vision. I'm honored to have you with us now as my dear beloved friend and sister in this work, to share with this circle of people around the world what you have shared with me. May your vision for peace come to pass. That is my prayer for this time. Welcome with love and aloha. Yeah. And next I want to welcome Jessica Lee. Jessica is a senior research fellow in the East Asian program at the Quincy Institute. Her research focuses on US foreign policy toward the Asia-Pacific region with an emphasis on alliances in North Korea. Jessica led the Council of Korean Americans, a national leadership organization for Americans of Korean descent. She began her career on Capitol Hill, where she served as a professional staff member handling the Asia region for the chairman of the House Committee on Foreign Affairs, and as a senior legislative assistant on international security and trade for a member of Congress on the Ways and Means Committee. Jess, I also just came to know of your work this past year, but only in preparing for today and visiting your author page at the Quincy Institute did I discover the sheer volume of articles that you produce with such extraordinary insight and wisdom. And for those of you who don't know about the Quincy Institute and their publication Responsible Statecraft, it is the light in Washington, showing a way forward to restore diplomacy and transform our militarized US foreign policy to a humane foreign policy. Welcome, Jess, and thank you for all you're doing. I'm going to welcome Dr. Kalamaoka'aina Niheu when she arrives. She'll be joining us shortly, but I'd like to get started now with you, Christine. So Christine, you work every day for peace and the denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. You're dedicating your life to this. We welcome you now to share your story of how you have come to this work.
Well, first of all, Cynthia, I'm so moved to tears. Thank you so much, Kumu Dawson, for that beautiful blessing. And Cynthia, your words are so loving And it's just incredible to see all of our friends that are on this Zoom call, many who actually were on that historic crossing in 2015, and right, Hejung Park, and so many supporters, Cinda Arsenault. And I love Jessica so much. I just feel like she's like such a voice of reason and truth and fierceness in Washington, D.C. So thank you for gathering us. I do feel like this is a very auspicious gathering. And I cry a lot, but geez, it's like 8 a.m. for me. And okay, let's get to it. So without going into like too much like life story, but I was born in South Korea. I immigrated here when I was 3 with my family. Very like insecure childhood, lots of moving. And part of that journey of trying to understand just the suffering and the hardship of my family, as working class immigrants, I sought to understand the world. And so much of that brought me to Korea and what had happened to Korea in the last century, from the colonization of Korea by Japan, to the division by Cold War powers, where Koreans had no say in what happened to their country, that it existed for thousands of years. And to know what happened in the Korean War that we are not taught. And so a desire to understand my own life experience in this greater context of all Korean people, and just learning and being connected to movements. I felt I couldn't, once I saw, and once I knew the critical history, it was just, I couldn't turn away. And so my life has been dedicated to both the advancement of the rights of women, the rights of children, and then, the right of the Korean people to sovereignty, to independence, to freedom, to live a life without war. And so that is how I came to do this work. And I feel every day so blessed to be able to be part of shining a light, being hope to try to transform our world. We don't have much time. And, I have a daughter now who is 9, Jeju. I know Jessica has a young daughter too. And, we're fighting for our futures, but we're also fighting for their futures. So that's in a nutshell. Gosh, where's my tissues? Where's my assistant with the tissues?
I don't know, but I need them too. Do you want to share the trailer now?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Great idea. Thank you. God, thank you for being my boss. Okay.
This is a film that is in process that's incredible, that I know is going to touch people all over the world. And we're just going to show a couple minutes of it.
Okay, so it is a film that is being made by Diane Bourché Lim, who is an Emmy Award-winning documentary filmmaker, and she's documenting our movement, our transnational feminist movement for peace in Korea. So without further ado, let me go back.
As a daughter of South Korean immigrants, I grew up being told stories about our homeland.
This is Korea, a nation divided at the end of World War II at the 38th parallel.
These stories made us fear North Korea, and it was something that I never questioned until much later.
More than 60 years after the ceasefire, North and South Korea and the U.S. are still technically at war.
I decided I needed to meet the people that were supposed to be my enemy. And that's when I started to understand the legacy of a war that never ended.
Breaking now in North Korea, women from around the world are preparing to make a demonstration for peace.
A prominent women's activist group is planning a symbolic and controversial walk across the demilitarized zone.
Women are disproportionately impacted by war and violence, and it's time to have a seat at the table.
A lot of people say it was naive and you cannot do this. Several hundred people are here to counter-protest against us. Anyone who calls on engagement with North Korea, they've been maligned.
If there's not agreement between the two militaries, the government does not feel that our safety would be assured. What are we doing that is so threatening? People think that the only way North Korea can be dealt with is to eliminate it. There is an image that there aren't real people and that they must be destroyed. 시민들 같은 경우는 마음의 분단심이라고 하나요? 마음의 삼팔선들이 있어요, 사실은. This artificial boundary has kept Korean people separated.
Okay, I'm back.
Yeah, every time I watch that, I am so moved and I cry and I think about that 38th parallel, like kind of like the Berlin Wall was, and all the artificial boundaries that separate people who belong together. So my next question for you, Christine, is what are you most concerned about? What keeps you awake at night? How worried are you that the unthinkable could happen, that nuclear weapons could be used again for the first time since Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and that this could be on the Korean Peninsula? What would this mean if it were to happen, the unthinkable, for the Korean people, for you personally, for your family, for the world?
I would say that we're sleepwalking to war with North Korea and China, that we're militarizing the entire Asia Pacific region due to this great power competition. So everybody that's actually on this call, Jessica, myself, Kalama, Kumu, Dawson, you, we're all being impacted, and so many millions of other people as a result of this unresolved war. As you know, in 2017, we were in the era of fire and fury, and the US had, or the Trump administration had a policy of the bloody nose strike, where the US was considering conducting a first strike against North Korea, which we know that would just lead to a counter retaliation. North Korea possesses somewhere between 20 to 60 nuclear weapons. And you know, if they're going to defend their country, they're going to use them. North Korea is the most sanctioned country in the world, and if there were to be an accidental or an intentional war, the Congressional Research Service estimates that in the opening days of a conflict, 300,000 people would be instantly killed, and were nuclear weapons used, up to 25 million people impacted. So this is no small matter. We have to do what we can right now to restart talks, to get to a peace agreement to formally end this war. And that's what we are all trying to do through our collective efforts.
Thank you for bringing that home to us today in this moment. So you and Women Across DMZ have taken a peace first pathway as a precondition to denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. Please explain why peace is so important to the Korean people, and how and why the memory of the Korean War, which is so forgotten in the United States, is so alive in Korea today.
Well, first of all, I want to shamelessly promote this report that the Korea Peace Now campaign, and Jessica actually wrote a piece in it as well too. She's kind of our de facto member. But it's basically where we take on all the obstacles that are used that prevent a peace agreement from fruition. And why a peace first approach? Because the last 30 years of whether it's Republican or Democratic administrations have totally failed to achieve the goals of denuclearization or advancing human rights. And so what we are arguing is, instead of dangling peace at the end of some kind of process, that you put it up front, that we have to address the root cause of the conflict, which is the unresolved Korean War in 1953. You know, the parties, the United States, representing the UN command, China, North Korea, all signed the armistice agreement. They promised within 90 days to return to negotiate a permanent settlement, and that has not happened. And so 71 years later, millions of Korean families still remain separated. As you saw in the video, 38th parallel, the DMZ continues to divide the Korean people. And we're seeing this massive militarization of the entire region as a result of this unresolved war. And we believe that you need to establish a peace first approach, that nothing else has worked. And this has not, I mean, honestly, it hasn't been tried. I think the closest we got was with Secretary Perry in the end of the Clinton administration, where we almost negotiated a non-aggression pact. And so there are massive costs. And in fact, just last week, Kim Jong-un, the leader of North Korea, announced that they're having very severe food shortages, the pandemic, the sanctions that the country experiences, where humanitarian aid can't get in, where medicine and essential medical devices can't even get in. So, and then, just the massive curtailing of civil liberties. When you were at war, think about when we were the period, and that still lives on today, like the mass surveillance of our entire country in the era of post 9/11. So we have to look at all the dimensions. And I think that's why women being and leading this conversation is so critical, because we're not just talking about North Korea's missiles or, and all of that is very important, but we look at the holistic picture of everybody that is being impacted by this conflict, and then bringing everybody together and centering the voices of those so that we have a much more effective path forward.
So much gratitude to you for that incredibly holistic healing approach, and, getting to the root cause, that you can't negotiate a nuclear agreement without dealing with the relationship. I know that in my work in US-Russia relations, it's the same thing. You can't expect nuclear weapons to suddenly be reduced if you don't address the root cause of the conflict in the relationship. So it's brilliant. Thank you. So in 2015, you launched Women Cross DMZ with an historic and truly courageous act of citizen diplomacy. You literally crossed the DMZ and walked arm in arm with 10,000 women in both North and South Korea for peace. And you called for three things, one of which you've spoken about is the peace agreement, the necessity of a peace agreement. What are the other two? And why are these three things critical for peace and denuclearization?
We called for a peace agreement. We called for the reunion of families, because we have to center those that are most impacted. And we know that, Koreans in their 70s, 80s, 90s, they're going to die soon. And their last wish is to see their loved ones on the other side of the border. And women's leadership at all levels of the peace building process. What hasn't worked is because it has been largely men that has negotiated this whole big man theory. And we need to democratize this peace process. And so those were the three things that we called for. And I don't know if we have a quick minute to just share some slides of that historic crossing, but let me just do that really quickly. So we announced that we were going to cross the DMZ in March of 2015. And we still hadn't gotten the full agreement. And in fact, it was South Korea under neocon president at the time who finally gave us the green light as we were crossing from China. But this is our press conference in China. And you can see there's Anne Wright and Hejong Park, who are on this call right now, just some extraordinary women peace activists, and collectively, a century of experience. We held a women's peace symposium in Pyongyang, where we heard from 250 North Korean. We sat in a room with 250 North Korean women. We heard about the impact of the unresolved war on their lives, but we also shared with them our stories of mobilizing for peace in conflict countries around the world, from Liberia to Northern Ireland, Colombia, and even there's Medea Benjamin talking about how Code Pink has been challenging US militarism around the world. And we held this beautiful stitching ceremony where we brought together quilts. The North Korean women had one. We brought one from South Korea, the Korean Diaspora and International Women, and we stitched back together the quilt as a symbolic gesture to reunify Korea. So this is the Peace March in Pyongyang with 5,000 North Korean women, and then 2,000 women in Kaesong, which is right along the border, South Korea. And let's see. And then this picture I love, this was as we were walking down the cobblestone streets of Kaesong, a Korean woman, elderly woman, was cheering for us with tears running down her eyes. And she clearly was born in Korea at a time that wasn't divided. And then we crossed into South Korea. 3,000 South Korean women met us in Paju, and we walked along the barbed wire fence of the DMZ. And then we held a peace symposium in Seoul, where we heard from South Korean women about the impact of the unresolved war. And anyway, that was our extraordinary journey.
So beautiful and inspiring. And, you know, you talk about the democratization of this policy and the need to democratize foreign policy and nuclear policy. And that's what we all are about trying to do right now, and especially bringing women in, as you've spoken and as you do. It's just so imperative. So, and I'm coming to that question now, you know, that you've built a women's movement for peace, and why women? You've spoken a little bit to this, but why is it imperative to involve more women in this process, in security and peace and nuclear policy, and specifically in the Korean, on the Korean Peninsula?
Well, Cynthia, you already said it. It's like the research shows that when women are involved in peace processes, it actually leads to a peace agreement, and one that lasts. And so that's why we're involved. We want to see a peace agreement. But another thing that's really interesting is there's a Georgetown University study that came out a few years ago, and it showed that the participation of women's groups helps to legitimize the formal peace process among the public. Like Women Cross DMZ has been calling for a peace agreement. And yes, movements have for decades. But there's something about the way that we can do it that, I don't know, that there's like a moral grounding in our call together as mothers, as the nurturers of our families, of our communities, of our society. And I think, you know, to my earlier point, it's like, we're redefining what security is, right? We're refuting this militarized notion of security. And in that process, it's what makes us secure? Is it clean air, clean water, the food that we eat, the jobs, living wage jobs that we have, healthcare, a decent society? And so I think that's why it's so critical that we are at the center of that conversation, that we don't leave it to the retired generals or the lobbyists that are representing the arms manufacturers. We have to define what makes us secure. And I think the way that women have historically been the nurturers of society, not to say that women are less violent. I think we've seen clearly plenty of hawks that tote a militarized masculine foreign policy. So I would say those are the reasons why it's so vital for us to be leading the conversation.
You just brought it all together in a way that's so powerful. Thank you. Thank you. So you speak so eloquently about the human costs of a US militarized foreign policy and the intersection of systemic racism with US foreign policy, war and nuclear weapons, and the legacy of this policy. How is this legacy impacting people on the Korean Peninsula, here at home, in our world, and how is it playing out specifically in the anti-Asian violence here in our communities, and particularly, how is this impacting women, Asian women?
I feel like Jessica has been like killing it on this anti-Asian violence, but when Trump called the COVID-19 the Wuhan virus or the Kung flu, this whole like anti-China rhetoric, just blew up. And it's not just the Republicans that do this, it's the Democrats. It's like bipartisan in their hawkish rhetoric against China, against North Korea. But if we actually look at the long history of US imperialism in the region, we've since the 1800s, through our gunboat diplomacy, where we like forced open markets and trade with countries like Japan, South Korea, China, with the gun, we have always had a kind of neo-colonial relationship with the entire region. And Hawaii, we know this well, and the way in which white colonial settlers with merchants and the military all conspired together to take away the sovereignty of so many countries. And when we look at the militarization of the Asia Pacific region, we're so seeing like images of China and the vilification of North Korea, but we don't even see that we have 300 US bases encircling China. And I just think that we have to draw the connection. Like, when an entire country can indiscriminately drop nuclear weapons and instantly incinerate 200,000 Japanese and Korean lives in Nagasaki and Hiroshima, when we can drop napalm and splatter it all across civilian populations in Vietnam and Cambodia and Korea, what does that do in terms of how we view Asians and Pacific Islanders in the US? We have to stop this militarization and this war if we want to end anti-Asian violence. So I know that's really big, and I know Jessica will go much deeper, but I just think it's important to put all of that historical and geopolitical context when we look at this rise of anti-Asian violence.
Thank you, Christine. When we hear about it, we don't ever see this put in the mainstream media in the geopolitical context and the historical context, and just in our own lives, the wars that we've seen, in Korea and Vietnam and Cambodia, as you've mentioned, all these places, and now this new Cold War with China. We need to understand that it's systemic, and it's a huge part of the problem that's impacting individual, real people's lives, really everywhere. So thank you for that. And so I want to now welcome you, Jess, again. And I want to invite you to maybe comment before we get into the other questions, if you want to add to the anti-Asian violence question, since we're on it right now, and then we'll come back to the other questions for you, because I think it's really important that you speak to that as well right now.
Absolutely. Sure. Thank you, Cynthia. And I was worried about going after Christine because I don't sound as articulate. And so it's very painful to go right after her. But really appreciate this opportunity to meet you, Cynthia, through Christine and Colleen and others who are working with you and others, to shine light on the issue of the Korean Peninsula and the elusive peace and stability that, we are, very much, looking forward to achieving someday, but it has taken a very long time. And, I'm afraid that with things like anti-Asian violence and other things that are going on in this country, that the US once again might miss an opportunity to really lead on this issue. So I'm happy to talk about that later as you go into some of the North Korea specific questions. But, as Christine said, I think the anti-Asian violence that we've seen really build and sustained, since, racialized terms like Kung flu virus, was endorsed and used at the highest level of US government. I think the most troubling part for me as an Asian American, as a woman, but also as a scholar who is writing about this issue and really studying, why this is happening, despite changes in the administration, right? And despite the fact that we no longer have a president who is saying things like China virus, we're still seeing violence grow. In fact, according to Stop AAPI Hate, which is tracking and collecting data about anti-Asian violence, we've actually seen violence grow by 164% in the first quarter of this year compared to the same quarter last year. And so, and according to Pew Research Center, 45% of Asian Americans adults have reportedly directly experienced racism since the start of the pandemic, which is over 10 million people. The actual number is probably much higher, given that these types of incidents are underreported, particularly among non-English speakers And so, I guess the point of all this is, we're seeing, despite, again, changes in, the language and the tone in which we're talking about the pandemic, still quite a bit of anger and violence that is being channeled to the Asian American community. And it's unclear whether and how this will end, because I think justifiably so, we've spent a lot of time, particularly in the May, Asian American Heritage Month, talking about the importance of AAPI communities' contributions to this country, and so forth. And I think that's really powerful and important part of educating, the general public about who we are and how long we've been here, that we're not, perpetual foreigners. But at the same time, unless we understand why, this violence is continuing, and I've written a lot about the fact that U.S. is pursuing a hyper aggressive foreign policy toward China, and that could be a real driver, because that policy during the Trump administration, the Biden administration has actually to a large degree endorsed that and said, yes, the strategic competition is the only path forward in U.S.-China relations. And so there's a lot of language, particularly emanating from Washington about China and its existential threat to Americans that I think is causing, anxiety and paranoia among American people. And I think this is, finding a lot of home in conspiracy theories and other, avenues as well. And so this is, I think, the nexus of, civil liberties and foreign policy that we really need to, I think, pay greater attention to.
Jess, I'm absolutely stunned. Maybe I shouldn't be, that 10 million people who have reported this recently, this anti-Asian violence, and that's only those who've reported it. And that I think it's really important that people understand that it doesn't matter right now whether it's a Democrat or Republican administration, that this new Cold War with China and the fueling of this violence is continuing, of this anti-Asian violence today in this new administration with the China policy. So it's really important. And so I'm going to come back to the other questions for you, which is to start with just saying that you're a leading expert in U.S. foreign policy in the Asia Pacific with a dedicated focus on North Korea, including nuclear risks on the Korean Peninsula. And you bring deep knowledge and insight to the pathway to peace and denuclearization. How have you come to this work, and what calls you to this work? Why do you do it?
Sure. Thank you again, Cynthia, for convening this forum, and for giving me a chance to share a little bit of my personal background on how I came to work on these issues. I want to start off by noting that more than 50 years ago, when Martin Luther King Jr. appeared wearing the Hawaiian lei during a march from Selma to Montgomery at the height of the civil rights movement, there wasn't, I think, a lot of recognition about what that meant and why he was wearing the lei and his connection to Hawaii and what he said about the Hawaiian kind of culture, its embrace of multiculturalism and sense of openness that I think is really beautiful. And, I actually had the honor of living in Hawaii for about 4 months back in 2015 and saw firsthand just kind of this, culture that really moved me and stayed with me for a very long time and continues to really, give me hope. Because I had come out of working in DC for about 6 years in Congress as a policy advisor. And one of the reasons I went to Hawaii for a fellowship was because I was just so burnt out and I was exhausted. I felt like, I really didn't have a good support network, people who reached out and invested their time in me, saw something in me that they recognized and really wanted to see me succeed. And I just, it was very difficult. So I guess, being able to kind of live in a place where I wasn't considered different or foreign looking because, of my Asian heritage, and just feeling very much accepted for who I was exactly the kind of recharge that I needed in order to kind of come back to Washington and continue this work in a very, competitive, male space. And so, Anyway, that's sort of a small kind of, tribute that I want to make to the Hawaiian kind of way of being that I think is really important for this conversation. So I was also born in South Korea, like Christine, and I grew up in New York and went to college in Boston area. And during the summer of my first year, after my first year of graduate school, I visited Hiroshima. And it was part of a student exchange program called Japan America Student Conference. And that visit really opened my eyes to the immeasurably tragic consequences of nuclear weapons. As a student of Korean history as well, I've I continue to grapple with the open wounds, as Christine talked about so eloquently, of the Korean War. And I think that's also really important to understand sort of the political dimensions of the North Korean nuclear issue and why North Korea is doing what it's doing. The fact that the Korean War never formally ended, despite 7 decades of time that have gone, and the Korean people, continue to live with the consequences of this, open-ended conflict. I think, it really does pose the question of why. Why is the status quo so bad? Why have we made so little progress in this area, despite many smart people working on this issue for so long? And as Christine said, despite coming so close to, having a deal during the Clinton administration, only to be scuttled by Republican opposition in Congress. So why is this happening? And why can't we do better? I think is something I think about a lot. And, as Christine noted, North Korea is a formidable country in terms of its nuclear arsenal. Experts now estimate between 40 to 50 nuclear weapons in its possession. And of course, during all of this, North Korea-US talks have stalled. And so the point that I've really tried to make in my writing is to highlight why this, really harms American interests, whether you're super conservative or super liberal or Democrat, doesn't matter. But as an American, you should be concerned that the status quo is not working. And that, on a broader level, we need to be thinking about the long-term future of the Korean Peninsula and the need for the Korean people to take ownership for that issue, rather than the US constantly seeking dominance. So just to conclude, I've been working in this space for about 13 years now, between Congress and think tanks and community organizing and so forth. And, I do think that, there is this tendency, I'm generalizing, but there is a bit of a tendency in Washington to kind of put the North Korea issue on autopilot. Kind of US is all about punishing North Korea for its nuclear weapons program that it illegally, that the international community condemns, as well as its human rights violations. And the US deliberately seems to be leaving aside the thornier question of peace and political reconciliation, even if it makes our ally much more dependent on the United States for its security, makes it more likely for US to be drawn into another war, probably a proxy war with China, and make inter-Korean reconciliation much, much more difficult. And so I guess, just drawing on my experiences from various, fields that I've been part of, I see that kind of knee-jerk reaction by, American policymakers really has it backwards. And Christina already alluded to this, but, I think the fact that North Korea, first of all, we must, I think it's important to recognize that North Korea's continued development of nuclear weapons and its violation of human rights are legitimate concerns for folks to have. But, I think the fact that the Korean War has never formally ended, and the fact that it's tied also to a very undemocratic and untransparent way in which that war even began, I think are really important questions the American public never really got closure on. We never quite figured out why the US went there and how it would kind of extricate itself and help create the conditions that would be, make it so that US is no longer needed. So I think these are the kinds of public debates and kind of, more scrutiny and consideration we should kind of have on this issue, rather than looking at it strictly through the lens of, well, how many nukes do they have? Okay, how many sanctions do we have? let's do some grandstanding and just see who can last longer in this, terrible game of chicken, and pretend that there's no human cost, because there is.
Jessica, I had no idea about your background in Hawaii, and it really touches me, and I'm sure it touches many of us on the call who live here and experience the grace of the culture that you described. And I didn't know about the Martin Luther King wearing the lei, or if I did, I'd forgotten about it. So that was really touching to me, and also your own that you are personally healing from this conflict, as so many are, and the wounds of this conflict, and that is part of what has called you to this work, and that you're taking that experience and channeling it into really making a difference. So grateful to you. And I want to ask you the question that I asked Christine about what you're most concerned about, and how concerned you are that the unthinkable could happen, that nuclear weapons could be used for the first time since Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and that this could be on the Korean Peninsula. Does this keep you awake at night? And what would this mean for the Korean people, and for you personally, and for the world? I mean, how worried are you about this?
Yeah, I mean, I think, it's definitely something I worry about. On one hand, I was reassured when President Biden said in a very terse reply to a question about whether North Korea was a top priority of the US, he said yes. And I thought, oh, okay, great. Well, this is great, because now we're going to really see some serious diplomacy and time invested in this issue, and really, not just kind of make this a niche kind of inside the beltway kind of issue, but more of like, here's why American public need to be concerned about the status quo, and here's what I'm going to do as president to make sure that Americans are kept out of harm's way, and that we avert an accidental nuclear crisis. I do think that there is going to be, but I am pessimistic about kind of the next steps. Just given what I've seen thus far, I could of course be pleasantly surprised, but it seems that to date, based on what I've seen and heard, the U.S. strategy is going to be it's supposed to be pragmatic and calibrated, and based on this wealth of information from past negotiators who have been through this process, so presumably well informed, but it does seem like at the end of the day we're sort of waiting for North Korea to take the first step, which is highly unlikely. And I think this issue of kind of grandstanding that I described earlier, and US's general position to be quite inflexible when it comes to what it's willing to give and not give, is very problematic. And so, what we've seen in the past is that the North Koreans then kind of, do something provocative and flashy to, manufacture basically a crisis and force, the U.S. to talk. And so this is a very undiplomatic way of doing foreign policy. And for President Biden, who has taken such pride in bringing such seasoned diplomats, it would be, I think, a tragic mistake to go down that path again. And I don't think the president wants that. But if he doesn't, he has to show an alternative and really lead us there and persuade and cajole those who are very skeptical that any negotiation with North Korea will be successful. I will also say that it's true that President Biden and the 117th Congress are faced with an unprecedented amount of challenges, particularly here at home, and that there are so many, hot issues for the administration and Congress to deal with at once, right? I mean, you can only, legislate so quickly. And so I think there are just some practical concerns that I have about the ability of this administration to, really handle the pandemic, lower the over-the-top language and threat inflation of China, while also, engaging in serious diplomacy with North Korea. I was encouraged, when Ambassador Sung Kim, the special rep for North Korea, recently said that U.S. is, willing to meet North Koreans at anywhere, anytime without preconditions. But again, I think, having studied, the past negotiations between the two countries, it's clear that North Korea is not going to be, it's not going to be confident in the process unless the administration is willing to signal that it's going to, use some of the carrots and sticks rather than have everything and then expect North Korea to do everything else. And I guess finally, it's been interesting, especially during my time on the Hill, seeing, Korean War veterans, bipartisan, members of Congress like John Conyers, Charlie Rangel, Sam Johnson, saying the Korean War has to end. And I really admire their tenacity in calling for this through resolutions and so forth. But now many, of those members are there are very few Korean War veterans left on the Hill, including Charlie Rangel, of course, who retired. And so I guess, the question is, can there be a political kind of, can there be political solution on the North Korea issue, without sufficient support and buy-in from Congress? And I think that's absolutely, impossible. And so what does that mean especially when you have a very vocal, number of senators and members of Congress who use this issue to kind of show that they're tough and informed on foreign policy, and really doesn't take into account, I think, the diversity of views, not just inside the Beltway, but outside. So I think there are some really difficult kind of structural challenges that are baked into, the status quo. I guess I'll end by saying, rather than worry that U.S. will somehow lose leverage, right? This is the big concern that many folks who oppose a political reconciliation, like ending the war, say, well, we'll lose leverage or we'll legitimize the Kim regime. I've said that the U.S. as the more powerful country should lead with the political question rather than, myopically focus on this very technical and long-term issue of denuclearization. And of course, Kim Jong-un's total lack of faith in the inter-Korean peace process, has been self-defeating. And, it's also done itself no favor by blowing up the liaison office in Kaesong, killing and burning a South Korean fisheries official, denigrating South Korea's general overtures on diplomacy, et cetera. So, it's not all US's fault, but the point is, both countries, knowing what is at stake and knowing how volatile the status quo is, need to come together and not really, kind of continue to kick this issue, kick the can down the road, and sort of pretend that the issue is not brewing bigger into a bigger and bigger crisis. So I hope that we can see more movement, not just in Washington, but also in Pyongyang, toward a more pragmatic approach forward.
Jess, thanks for bringing all the different sides, perspectives into this and what needs to happen. You've touched on a number of the questions that I had for you in some of your answers already, but I guess my final question would be, what happens if the US continues to maintain an inflexible policy, maximum pressure, sanctions, insisting on denuclearization as a precondition for the peace agreement, and if things continue in this direction, what do you see happening down the road from the North Korean side? And you mentioned just now everyone, having a recognition of the stakes. So I guess the other part of the question is what is it going to take, do you think, for the peace agreement and the denuclearization, from the perspective of someone who's spent so much time on the Hill, and also what other countries need to be involved in this process to resolve the unresolved war and to be involved in supporting the peace agreement? And I think about the JCPOA in Iran. I think about that multilateral process, and one of the reasons that it was originally successful was because of that. So I'd like to hear your perspective on that as well.
Yeah, those are great questions, Cynthia. I don't know that I can do justice because they're so challenging, but I'll do my best. They are really the most critical questions, on this topic. I do think a lot about sort of the current political environment and what seems to be a very much a concerted effort, a whole of government approach toward thwarting China's influence, what some call malign influence, which is a very broad term that could be used to create xenophobia and create anxiety among Chinese nationals as well as Chinese Americans. So there are a lot of things, as I said in the beginning, that connect this issue not just at the foreign policy level, but also at the domestic kind of security, human rights level for Americans. And so it's quite difficult to sort of untangle everything. But I think first of all, as you know, I have studied the Senate bill called the Strategic Competition Act that is part of this very much methodical legislative effort to codify, this kind of full spectrum competition and rivalry with China. And so when I looked at that bill, it was interesting in the 400-page Senate bill that has now been embedded into a 1,400-page Senate bill called U.S. Innovation and Competition Act. There's language that that it is the U.S.'s policy to maintain sustained maximum economic pressure against North Korea until it takes complete, verifiable, and irreversible actions toward denuclearization. And so, this kind of declarative, like present and future kind of seeming sentence of like, that's just how it is. There are no other aspects of U.S. policy worth highlighting, never mind that we didn't really even have a sufficient debate, and that the public probably doesn't know. I would very much doubt that anyone really knows that in a China bill, there's this language about maximum sanctions against North Korea. It's just sort of like put in there as part of, pressuring China to do more, perhaps, to squeeze North Korea. But, again, very undemocratic, untransparent way of influencing foreign policy, particularly when the Biden administration is trying to kind of do its thing and have its shot at, advancing this issue. So, the fact that Congress is sending signals like this is very unhelpful and confusing, I think, and doesn't bode well. But anyway, I think sort of, the broader issue of sanctions is something that, Christine and others have written about. And I was surprised in a conversation with a senior, State Department official that, even they don't seem to really recognize that there are real secondary order impact of economic sanctions that stigmatize legitimate humanitarian activities to help North Korean people in need. And so, I think the idea is, well, US policy is that we would not do that, that there would be waivers for humanitarian aid. So what's the problem? What do we do wrong? And it's like, okay, that might be the US policy on paper, but in actuality, when you talk to actual groups that deliver aid and work with North Korean people in need, the reality is much more different. And so I think there is that disconnect as well between what folks in Foggy Bottom think is happening and what actually takes place. So that's, I think, another dimension of US policy toward North Korea that deserve more attention. If US policy, foreign policy, is going to be values driven, and we have this situation where we're not able to deliver aid, by internationally recognized NGOs because of US sanctions policy that, again, stigmatize these activities, even if they are not meant to. Banks just don't want to take a chance. And so, we've created this environment that really ends up hurting, people that the US government has not intended to hurt. And so I think these are the things we need to sort of course correct. And I guess, there are, as you were alluding to, there are real differences, between United States and China and Russia, right, when it comes to how to address this issue. China obviously doesn't want instability along its borders, and it will take a tough stance on North Korea if it crosses the line. But Chinese leaders, for the most part, have long made very clear that they support a peace process with North Korea. In fact, in December 2019, China and Russia jointly proposed lifting some of the UN Security Council's ban on North Korea exporting seafood and textiles, but the United States opposed that draft measure. And so, it's going to, I think, require some new thinking on the part of the United States as to, how it's going to work with countries like China and Russia that clearly have a stake too. And they live in the region. And so, it's, I think, vitally important that we have that we consult them and that we try to find common ground rather than kind of bulldoze our way through and expect that countries will just kind of follow our orders. I think the reality is much more complicated, and the more we insist on very inflexible policies, I think the more we risk isolating ourselves and making ourselves irrelevant in the conversation. And so, there are many ways I think that the status quo doesn't serve our interest in the end.
Jessica, I really appreciate that really comprehensive answer to a really complex question. And I did not know about the Strategic Competition Act and the North Korea component that's hidden in there until I read your article, one of your recent articles about it. And what you raise about the transparency is so important that we don't even know these things are going on. And unless we're tracking this as an expert in the community. So it's a real challenge for us and something we need to find a way to pay attention to. So thank you for shining the light on that for us in your work. And I just see that Dr. Kalamaoka'aina Niheu has arrived, and I want to warmly welcome you. I'm so glad that you're able to join us. And I'd like to just begin by introducing you now. Dr. Kalamaoka'aina Niheu is a Kanaka Maoli family physician and associate medical director for COVID response at Lifelong Medical Care. She is also the co-founder of the Standing Rock Healers Council and the Mauna Madic Healers Hui, and physician for Onipa'a Hui Kalo, a Hawaii-wide coalition for the revitalization of Native Hawaiian traditional kalo farming and food sovereignty. Her published works include The Impact of the Military Presence in Hawaii on the Health of Na Kanaka Maoli, Pu'uhanua Sanctuary and Struggle at Makua, Hawaii, Indigenous Resistance in an Era of Climate Change Crisis and Standing Rock Violence and the Militarization of Police. Kalama, I just came to know of you and your blessed work last month when I heard you speak for the first time. And I was so deeply moved, especially by all the ways that you bring the threads together of how what is happening on the Korean Peninsula comes home to us here in Hawaii, across the Pacific, and impacts people all over the world. Your breathtaking, powerful words, when I heard you speak, moved me to tears. So I just want to deeply, warmly welcome you with bows of appreciation for all you do. And thank you so much again for being here with us. Welcome, Kalama.
Aloha, Aina. Thank you so much. It was I think you're referring to the false missile, false alarm, which is a documentary that was recently a presentation. It was, it's been a pleasure to work with Christine and everybody else to try and tie the threads together, because I think the work is too big and too heavy for any one of us to lift alone.
Welcome. So I want to just start with my questions for you now. You've done groundbreaking work on the intersectionality of nuclear weapons, militarism, colonization and occupation, climate justice, nuclear colonialism, denuclearization, and so much more. For those of us living in Hawaii, as I said, you bring this home to the place we live. So again, deep bows of appreciation to you. And please share your story of how you've come to your blessed work for peace, justice, and denuclearization.
I think this is a kind of I'm unlike a lot of people. I think my upbringing was a very atypical. My mother was a revolutionary communist, Marxist-Leninist Maoist, who worked as a very staunch ally with the Kanaka Maoli people all my life. My father is a Kanaka Maoli or Hawaiian independence internationalist. So I was really raised in a way that was very different from most folks. My father was on the steering committee for the Nuclear Free and Independent Pacific movement. So my computer restarted for some reason. I'm not sure.
Oh, great. You're back. Wonderful.
I'm just going to join you via my phone. So to pick up where I left off, basically what happened was my father was in the steering committee for the Nuclear Free and Independent Pacific. And because of the work that he's done, we were very clear about what
are the relationship of the Pacific Island is as a nuclear playground for the world's powers. So I grew up thinking that everybody thought that. As a child, which is I came to realize was definitely not the case, but it certainly impacted my worldview. As a child, I actually had right outside of my door in the hallway, there was a map of the island of Oahu that showed the effects of the impact if a nuclear bomb the size of Hiroshima or Nagasaki were to drop on Oahu. And I just remember those, concentric circles just showing the level on each place. And in the place where I grew up in Kala'ava, but it said it was immediately our eardrums would explode, and because of the sound from the impact, even if it was over the mountain, and it would be only a matter of days that we would, that we would survive because of the nuclear fallout if they targeted Pearl Harbor. The other thing that I had, so I remember just standing there in the hallway, just looking at that. And I don't even know how old I was. I'm guessing I was like maybe 6 years old. And I remember just having this feeling of nausea in the bottom of my stomach. The other thing that happened that I remember, like one of my earlier memories was I came across a comic book that I found in one of my father's friend's library, because we'd go all over the place and work with different people my parents would, and we'd end up trying to look around and explore. And one of the things I found was what I thought was a comic book for kids. And while I was waiting for them to, have their conversations and meet, I started thumbing my way through it. And it told the horrific story of a young man in the aftermath of Hiroshima. And those of you might not may be familiar with it, but it's called Barefoot Gen. And Barefoot Gen is a story, and it's an incredibly powerful story about a young boy about my age and his sister, and everybody trying to survive in the aftermath, and how horrific the aftermath of that particular devastation was on the human beings, the very real toll. So it wasn't an abstract idea for me about this nuclear horror that could happen. It was something that I felt was very real, and it was always considered to be very imminent. Especially in Pearl Harbor, making us Barefoot Gen. Actually, I think I think I can kind of, let me switch over this camera. I was hoping to switch this over to show you guys in screen share, but I think I'm going to be able to at least show you on the screen. So this is what it's called, Barefoot Gen, a cartoon story of Hiroshima. And so basically that was, it was like such an intense story about this child, and it really, I'm sure there were thousands of stories that were just like his. Thanks for adding it. So it's, I think that was something that I always grew up realizing that this was something that was an imminent threat, not just to other people and abstractly, but very intimately to somebody that looked like me, walked like me, talked like me. And it was something that you kind of think externalize outside of yourself, and don't really, it's such a big thing to try and take on, that it's really hard for a young mind to grasp that. So the next thing that I think probably the thing that actually kind of became more personal was when the French started retesting in Tahiti in the 1990s. And that's when people I know, we had done international work with Tahiti. We knew people from the Marshall Islands and from Motorola that were removed from their homes and forevermore are not allowed to go back because of the nuclear fallout in their area. And people that we knew that gave birth to jellyfish babies that breathed and moved and quickly died later on because of that exposure. There's KJ Johnson was somebody who died of cancer, who was a big advocate for the Marshallese people. She was somebody that was a really good friend of my father. So when he passed, all of these stories were very immediate to me. And so what I did was I was a part, I think I was like 18 or 19 at the time. I helped start the Hawaii Coalition Against Nuclear Testing, and we made alliances with people throughout Hawaii, and also with particularly the Tahitian people in French-occupied Polynesia. And, I also know some French, so I helped translate some of our education materials into French for the Tahitian people so we could actually communicate with them. So I think that this was something that was like a big part of my coming of age, in my family, understanding your role in history and the ways that you can possibly affect society around you is really a family heritage, savelo, which is like a characteristic of a family. And our family believes that, no matter how large and how massive the waves of history may be, there's always a chance that you can affect change.
Kalama, thank you for sharing how personal this is for you and your amazing journey from childhood to this point. It's really, really moving. So I'm going to ask you a question I asked the others, what you're most concerned about and how concerned you are that nuclear weapons could be used again for the first time since Hiroshima and Nagasaki and perhaps on the Korean Peninsula, and what this would mean to you and for the Korean people and your family and the people of Hawaii and the people of the world.
Well, I think that the deep fear that we all had when the false missile alert happened and when Trump was in power, and Kim Jong-un was on the other side, and they were having this social media war where you really felt on this very visceral level that all of this power should never happen. It should never be allowed to be concentrated in a way that two horrible, basically, people who didn't seem to really care about anybody else might potentially end up starting something that an extinction level event. So, the basic issue of like whether or not it's actually, gonna happen, like it became very real for us. And even though I understood the logistics of what happened, when the false missile crisis occurred, I didn't actually think that we were gonna get bombed. I think that it was a big wake up for everybody to pull back from the current, that this is something that could definitely happen. But I think people need to realize that it could definitely could have happened under Obama, it could happen under Biden as well. That this is the threats of nuclear weaponry are massive, and we don't know what we're certainly not the people making those decisions. A lot of people making those decisions aren't people we would necessarily trust. So for me, I think, however, that the biggest concern that I have is because of that kind of standoff, that nuclear standoff that's happening. I'm really worried about that there would actually be kind of a reemergence of this new Cold War era like we had before in the 80s, when that was an ever-present threat. And that, if anything, the most likely thing to happen is that we'd have places outside of that there would be a conflict that arises between U.S. China and the China and the Russia, in which other countries and other homelands would be on the ground for this proxy war that North and South Korea and Hawaii are intimately familiar with. The people that we know who pay the price will be our families, will be our ohanas, our communities, our friends, our lands, our resources. It'll be torn apart because as we are on the edges of their empires, we are not the people foremost in their mind protecting. We are part of the colonial project and the imperialistic project for them to be able to destroy our homes without being touched in their own homeland. That they can threaten this violence, and the people that actually pay for it will be us. So part of the Cold War efforts included atmosphere testing, and an atoll name was sharing the same name that I have, called Kalamaoka'aina Atoll. The United States actually did do atmosphere testing in Hawaii. Not a lot of people realize that, but those other types of things that will happen in a future Cold War. So of course, annihilation is absolutely something that is worrisome to me. But what I'm most worried about is what is going to actually happen if they resume this Cold War. The land that they will take. We know that indigenous peoples are at the source of all, mining, transportation, testing, application. But we are usually at the forefront of paying the price for these types of nuclear races. So I think that I think the world needs to be a part of stopping this entire process. And there, like I said before, there's no way that we can do it or take it on all by ourselves. We need to make these connections. And in order to make this in order to stop it, we need to realize how it affects all of us. And a Cold War process will not benefit anyone except for the people, the military war machines, the weapons producers, and the people who are in power, who are not you or I or anybody on this field right now.
Again, Kalama, thanks for bringing that, tying all those threads together again, as you do so beautifully, and for bringing that moment to us where it became visceral here in Hawaii, and that wake-up call that's here, and how it connects with the history of the legacy of colonialism and who would be most disproportionately impacted as we continue, if we continue in the direction of this new Cold War with Indigenous peoples, and women actually being the most disproportionately impacted. So in 2018, you traveled with Christine and a delegation to Korea when tensions were running high again between Donald Trump and Kim Jong-un, and the threat of nuclear war was escalating. Would love to hear from you what this experience was like for you, what it meant to you, and any inspirations you have for achieving peace and denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula.
That was such a powerful experience, and I'm so grateful to all the people who organized it, particularly Christine, who knew my history, and mentioned in the comments that for me, I'm not only in my Kanaka-Maoli, but I'm also very proud of my Korean ancestry as well. I'm a fourth generation Korean, and some of my family members actually fled Korea during the Japanese Korean War at the turn of the century in 1906. So this is the first time I ever had gone to Korea to actually be there. And here was part of this incredible work with the Women Across the DMZ and the Women's Laureate Group. And we had this plan of how we're going to go about the whole, our visit there. Then in the middle of that, here we have this, this Twitter war between, President Trump and, Kim Jong-un. And here we are, okay, now we are here. We're going to completely change our agenda. We're going to come up with a strategy every morning and enact it throughout the day. And it was, actually, I thought it was such a powerful visit, because then I got to see all these different women who would before just talk about what they're doing, actually start putting into motion quickly press releases, responses, strategy, communications back to their home group, and then tying into a larger strategy to push for ongoing talks between the two leaders of North and South Korea, and to continue on with the plan and the desire to unify the nation that was torn apart by these powers that were external and really not looking at the best interest of the Korean people as a whole. And it was just so beautiful, because we all broke up going into these different embassies and also talked to the South Korean Parliament, and presented at their press conferences, and really was saying, this is right now. It's not up. The United States isn't the only person determining the course of Korea. The Korean people have to determine it for themselves. And we encourage the leaders of the North and South Korea to continue to meet together, no matter what was, whatever that Cheeto was saying across the ocean. So they made a decision to meet while we were there, and it was an historic meeting. There was some question about whether or not they would actually do it, and they actually met, and they both reaffirmed their desire to continue with the reunification. And so I think that there was such a beautiful, powerful, thing to do together with a group of beautiful, powerful women. And I think the other thing that, on a side note, that was really remarkable was how we were in the newspapers everywhere. And we actually never even got, I think I saw one paragraph in the Associated Press in the United States. People never heard about the work that we did, even though it was covered extensively. And I think we did play a pivotal role. So that was my honor to do that. And I think that's part of the things that, helps me keep going, keep the fight on.
What timing of that trip. I'm really struck by that. Is just extraordinary that you were all there at that moment, and that you all came together and just, in that moment on the spot shifted into an action that really made a difference. So really so inspiring to all of us, that at any moment to be prepared to actually be ready to step up, and how exciting, how exciting and inspiring. So I want to thank you, Kalama, and move now to the questions that I have for all of you. Actually, Kalama, I have one more question for you. Just the intersectionality of what you're working on here in Hawaii, the other issues that I mentioned earlier, and what's at stake in the Korean Peninsula, how you really bring it home here.
Thank you. So the question is, how do I bring that intersectionality home? Okay. So basically, I think that if you really understand the production and the manufacturing, the testing and utilization of nuclear weapons, Hawaii, because of its central role in PACOM, is inextricably intertwined with the fate of Korea. And so we're also involved with what's happening in China, as well as what's happening in South America and the United States. It's inescapable. And for me, my vision is to look at, previously Hawaii was planned to be a United Nations instead of a war center. And so what my dream would be is for it actually to return to be a diplomatic center and to remove the military presence in Hawaii. I think that will benefit the world because we do need to have a neutral ground, like a Switzerland of the Pacific, for these really huge global powers that are just warring on our shores. And I think that this is something that will be a huge benefit for the people of Hawaii too, to have something of peace instead of war. And I think it'll be beneficial for the rest of the world for us to continue our move towards independence. Because if we remove PACOM, we remove all of the bases, like 110 military installations in Hawaii alone. If we remove those installations, that'll be a huge step towards peace. And this is something that I think, it'll only be possible if we look at the intersectionality. And I always work with particularly international folks, but I also work with our African American and Black brothers and sisters to uphold their work, because as we all know, that the war on drugs, the military buildup has been a straight line into bringing in the MRAPs and also the military equipment into the militarization of police, and was a directly resulted in the violence in the Black communities, as well as the violence that we saw at Standing Rock. They're all totally connected, the domestic and the international violence with these military weaponry. It's all one long continuum, and people don't realize how deeply and intensely they're connected. Billions of dollars of weapons grade munitions and all types of supplies have been flowing directly into our, your community, my community, and everyone's community in the United States. Free, and all you have to do is write a paper, sign a paper, and ask for it, and you can get a tank.
Kalama, I love your vision that Hawaii becomes a center for peace and like a United Nations instead of the militarized center, the war center you called it, that it is. People don't realize that we have 110 military installations here. So my prayer is that that happens. May it be so. Okay, so now I'd like to move to the final questions for all of you, and I invite you to answer, whoever wants to answer first. So let's see, this work is incredibly challenging. Many are so afraid they don't even want to go near it. Many lose hope, say it's too big. They even fall in despair. And so at these hardest moments, the most challenging moments for each of you, what do you do? Where do you find your resilience? What brings you the courage and determination to go on? And with all of your work to bring peace and denuclearization to the Korean Peninsula, where do you find the hope and inspiration? Where do you find the light? And so whoever would like to go first, I welcome you.
Well, since nobody's jumping in and I might get pulled off, um, how I find my inspiration is every time I drive on the long drive home from Honolulu over to Ka'ava, which is on the northeast shore of Hawaii, on the island of Oahu. That long stretch of green and beauty and openness and wilderness. I remember and I understand and I always honor the fact that, it's part of the legacy of my family and other families like mine on that side, that it wasn't developed into nothing, that it wasn't a concrete jungle. It's actually the jungle remains, our aquifer remains. That whole side is undeveloped because of the fight that my family in particular was directly involved to the Waiahole Waikane struggle and also through the Protect Kahana Ohana, and other struggles like that they wanted to develop our community, and also the Envision Laie, where they're trying to make it into another Waikiki. Like, it would, if it wasn't for people like us and my family, that whole place, there would be no wild in Hawaii. There would be no country, and there would be just an endless Waikiki spilling over from Waikiki and Honolulu into the communities, and there would be no place for local people to live in beauty, and our aquifer as an island would be overthrown. So the work that I try to do, as I realize it's connected to that international work, but I'm also very grounded in my own community and back home in my family, and every day I can see the beauty and the triumph of a battle well fought and won.
What a beautiful success story, inspiring to share with us. That you can, that is a result of your efforts and your family's efforts, and so many here. Christine or Jess, who would like to go next?
I would say it's probably two things. One is just seeing ordinary people when they organize together, they build power together, that we could actually make a difference. And, I've been working on the Korea issue for almost 20 years of my life. And, a decade ago, I helped organize a congressional briefing on the 60th anniversary of the Korean War. And we could only get 2 members of Congress to actually speak up, speak out about making peace with North Korea. Not even talking about a peace agreement, but just like the need to have peace with North Korea. And that was Barbara Lee, the one lone voice who opposed the US invasion of Iraq and Afghanistan and the authorization to use military force, and Dennis Kucinich, who was known as the peace member of Congress. And now, a decade later, through our grassroots organizing, we've now seen, in the last House, in the last Congress, there was a House resolution that was introduced by Ro Khanna, and they're calling for an end to the Korean War with a peace agreement. And we got 52 members of Congress. And that doesn't happen, especially in such a toxic place like Washington, D.C., where North Korea is so vilified, and that so much of Washington is financed and backed by lobbyists, by arms dealers and weapons manufacturers, and the military industrial complex. And so to actually see that progress tangibly, when people and grassroots people organize and build power, I think that's so enlightening. And then obviously spaces like this to actually, envision together what a different future could be, and to see that there are so many movements that are converging, but also like working, deepening the struggles. I think that's so deeply inspiring.
I can go next. I think for me, I mean, Christine knows this, but this is just a very difficult work, as not just because, North Korea is such a difficult issue, but also just given the rising rhetoric and xenophobia that we're seeing in this country, that is dividing Americans, and really, pushing US, I think, toward a place that, I worry about. And so I think as an Asian American, been particularly difficult last year and a half. Even setting aside the North Korea issue, just in general, as I think Cynthia's question was alluding to, like sometimes you just want to give up because the questions you're trying to answer are so difficult and are so tied in with sort of the broader dynamics that privileges some voices over the others, and so that's been, I think, my biggest kind of struggle. But I think for me, there are just I find quiet inspiration from folks who are just doers. They don't really care about taking credit, but they just get things done. And I really like that because like I can relate as somebody who's just like constantly is like trying to get things done. Like it doesn't matter who, but like you always have to look for partners, even among folks you may not agree with on like 99 other issues. If they're on board with this one issue, it's like in both of our interests to try to find common ground because we're trying to do something that is different from the mainstream. And I think, that's been really great in terms of seeing folks who are asking the hard questions. They're writing, letters to the editor of their local newspaper. They're, getting together with organizations, national organizations, to be part of a broader movement and doing things, because it matters to them, not because it looks good on their resume or, it gives them something. It's just, they're doing it because they have this shared kind of appreciation that what we're trying to do is just so important, that's going to outlive us in terms of its legacy, that all we can do is really try to channel our kind of energy in a constructive, positive way, because staying on the sidelines and being like, oh well, that's stupid, well this person's really not that, like that's really easy, but you're also not doing anything like in terms of changing the actual policy outcome. So if you're in the fight and you're doing what you can to really, help advance and change the future toward a more peaceful one. I mean, that to me is really inspiring because it's not easy. Nobody thanks you for it, but you're doing it because you really feel that this is, what we should do for humanity. It's also the right thing to do, and that for too long, people of color, women have consistently been excluded in policy conversations. And even for me, who lives in Washington and analyzes policy, I'm reading these massive bills and I am having a really hard time understanding what they're saying and how they draw these conclusions. So I can only imagine for other people outside of DC, when they look, from there to what's going on here, what they must think. And so we really need to, I think, find new ways to inject, diverse views, so that we're not really just kind of recycling the same stale policies and calling it a different name, but we're actually doing something that propels us toward a different outcome. And so I think folks who are doing that in whatever capacity are really my inspiration, because somehow it's crazy, but somehow all of these things end up kind of coming together. I think that's kind of the thing I never really expected. When you look at my resume, you think like, okay, she's done this and that. It seems so like kind of disconnected. But I've been able to kind of harness the things that I've learned from these various jobs toward my current job and learn from people along the way. And I think similarly, there are just kind of, ways in which we're sort of all working in concert, but we may not know it at the moment. But I think the more we kind of, tap into the passion and look at history, learn from history, in terms of what, past policies have done in terms of North Korea issue, but also more broadly, the Asian American xenophobia and stuff, just simply pointing to facts alone is super powerful, because a lot of times people don't want to acknowledge that this is in a lot of ways things we've seen before, starting in the 1850s in terms of xenophobia against Chinese migrant workers. And so there's, I think, some serious blind spots, and kind of negligence as well in terms of kind of recognizing our past that needs to be kind of reckoned with. And the more we have people pushing for these kinds of discussions, the more chance we'll actually have those discussions in mainstream media, in the halls of Congress, in the White House. And I think it just will take some time, but we need all the help we can get. And I'm always really encouraged when I see people quietly stepping up.
Love that, Jess, and love you're shining the light in that place. It's really a challenging place to be. It's you're dealing with a lot there, and you're bringing all of what you've just said you find inspiration from others to your work. So mahalo for that.
Cynthia, you're on mute.
I'm sorry. Thank you, Christine. Jess, I was just saying thank you for bringing those inspirations forward, that you live in that place and bring that light to in Washington. So my last question for each of you is, and again, in any order, and with each of you, and specifically with the work you do, how can we help you, Christine, with Women Across DMZ, Jesse, with your work with Quincy and in Washington, Kalama, with your work to bring peace and justice and denuclearization to the Korean Peninsula and beyond, all of you with that work in Korea. How can we support you in your work? How can we get involved? What do you need? What concrete steps can we take? And what would you suggest that we can start doing right now today? Would love to hear from each of you what we can do specifically for the cause of peace and denuclearization in Korea, and how this connects with the specific work that you're doing on this issue.
I can get us started. So many of you may have seen the chat by Echo, who is one of our grassroots organizers with Women Across DMZ. And the first thing is we need your help to raise our voices together, to let the members of Congress know that, let your member of Congress know that we support peace with North Korea, that we want to see a formal resolution of the war. And so we are organizing a virtual advocacy week in July, and it would be fabulous for you guys to sign up. It's like, I swear, not more than 3 hours, and you can make such an important impact as we grow the numbers of members of Congress that put pressure on the Biden administration to negotiate a peace settlement with North Korea. So that's number one. Number two, as many of you saw, there's the documentary film Crossings. Well, Deanne is going to try to hit all the big and important international film festivals, but then we're going to do a massive rollout nationally. As you see, there's so much misinformation about North Korea. There is so much vilification of the people, and we need to change that. We need to be building the political will and normalizing the prospect of peace with North Korea. And to do that, like to have that film in your town center, at your university, at your church, like we need all of your support. So please contact us. Echo could put, info at Women Across DMZ. Contact us. Be ready to screen that film. And three, it's like all of our organizations need support. Most of Women Across DMZ is like 1,000 donors since we started in 2015. Yes, we get foundation support and some very wealthy institutional donors, but we also have a big grassroots space. And I think that also shows the power that is also with us. So those three things would be fabulous. Thank you.
Thank you, Christine. Jess or Kalama?
I can go next. Sure. I think there are a lot of ways you can be, part of these efforts, including, following Quincy Institute, getting on our email list so that you can see our, analyses. I'm also very active on Twitter, so you'll always see things that I'm writing or commenting on as well. And yeah, I think just, being heard, whatever that means to you. I mean, I was so surprised, like I said, when I lived in Hawaii briefly, just how well connected everyone was in the community. Like in a matter of days, I was like already like part of the Wellesley alum, group that, I'm a Wellesley alum, and, like all of these different kind of communities already were really well networked and in constant communication. And I think there's part of that too, is like, just find your networks and figure out, put this on the map, like just, suggest that this be a topic and talk about it. Draw in things that you've read or heard, get reactions, and, brainstorm together as to how you can act, in your individual capacity to move this very difficult issue. I think people will be really surprised by how well networked we all are if we seek feedback from folks. Like I said, I didn't know anyone in Hawaii going in, but in a matter of days, people had just so graciously connected me to various folks that it was just an incredible experience. And I hope no matter where you live, whether it's Hawaii or, continental, it doesn't matter. I mean, we all have our networks, and I think this is an issue that really requires, a very thoughtful, both individual, but also kind of organizational and national response.
Thank you, Jess. Kalama, would love to hear from you.
So I think first off, I really love for everybody here to donate to Women Cross the DMZ. I'm not a member of that organization, so I have no fiscal, so no fiscal benefits from that. But I think the work that's being done is really, really very important. Because in order to get some of these things done, I think those diplomatic missions by people who are doing good work on the ground in the communities that they're from, I think it really helps a lot, because it certainly opened my eyes a lot to what the people are doing there, and the connections and the similarities and the amazing people and all the work they're doing. So those international diplomatic reaching out I think is going to be helpful for all of us as a whole throughout the world, because they're building up. They've always built up North Korea as the boogeyman and the excuse for global nuclear annihilation. So what we can do to help support that will be really important moving forward. I also think that people need. I would always also ask for everybody to build at home work that really affects the home and where you're at, and how things that it connects to, things like climate change, demilitarization. Because if you can get your communities involved on the ground, we're all connected to this, and we all benefit in this really horrific way, as well as pay this huge price, particularly BIPOC communities. So recognizing the land that you're on, the fact that it's a part of this global, it's the reason why they're defending themselves, why they need nuclear weaponry, because they need to defend the land that was stolen, the land that's stolen from people that are still here, people who survived genocide, pandemics, infection, land clearances, evictions. We're still here, and we're still have a lot of, we're still trying to fight for these really important struggles and make these connections. So if you'd like to help support and learn more about Hawaii and the work that we're doing in the modern Hawaiian movement, you can purchase the book Ea Nation Rising. I have a chapter in there that talks about what healing looks like for a houseless community that has faced decades and generations of eviction at Makua, Hawaii, to be displaced by the military, who I think basically pays a lease of $1 for 65 years to bomb with live ammunition that area in order to practice taking Pacific Island, or an island nation similar to my own homeland, like they did in 1893. And I also try to ask people to really try to make those connections across these to African Americans, to Indigenous communities, to Asians, to women, to different folks, because there's this phenomenon that I call the white supremacy superhighway, and you can read about it in my upcoming book if I've ever had the chance to finish reading it. But it basically talks about, in this section, it talks about how the ways that we have to access each other and reach each other, the well-worn ways are through this white supremacy superhighway. And so this basically, that's what we're used to, and we enter each other's communities through this way. And it's a way that's incredibly violent, it's alienating, and it's exploitative. So what we need to do is we need to forge ourselves pathways and ways that are not destructive to our communities and our environment, to actually reach out and make these connections directly without accessing them through the white supremacy superhighway. And so that means having meaningful connections with people who are not stereotypes, they're not abstract ideas, but actually work directly with them and find how you can meet common ground. And that's part of what we did with Justice for Colin Elderts, this is his the 10-year anniversary in the murder of Colin Elderts by federal agent Didi when he was drunk on the town. And they were going to look at doing a 10-year commemoration of that. But that's how I made connections to Black Lives Matter before BLM happened. The nuclear free movement is how I made connections to Standing Rock, and eventually ended up there creating the Medi-Killers Council. So, find the things that mean a lot to you, and then figure out ways that connects to other people, because that's the way that I think we are going to move forward and lift this heavy burden from all of us.
Thank you so much, Kalama. Now we're going to move back to where we started in terms of today being still in the light of the solstice, to share something else that's going on that involves Christine and Korea, and just a little bit of background on it. In 1990, Buddhist Lama Cynthia traveled to a remote part of Nepal and met the 106-year-old Tibetan Buddhist Lama H.E. Kushuk Mangdon Charok Rinpoche in a cave. And she asked him the question, what can I do to bring healing and protection to the earth? Charok Rinpoche initiated her in an ancient earth treasure vase practice and blessed her with 30 earth treasure vases. He instructed her to take them home, gather in sacred ceremony, fill them with prayers and offerings, and then bury them in places around the earth that need healing and protection. Since then, thousands of people around the world have gathered in earth treasure vase ceremonies with elders, activists, spiritual and political leaders, and people from all walks of life, filling the vases with light, prayers, and offerings, with vases now safely buried in locations around the world, including Los Alamos, Hiroshima, Hanford, the Tritium facility at UC Berkeley, Indian Point Nuclear Reservation, Fukushima, Liberia, the Democratic Republic of Congo, Israel, Palestine, the Martin Luther King Freedom Center in Oakland, California, Papua New Guinea, Australia, and here in Haleakala in Hawaii. Many more connected in a global mandala for healing and protection of the earth. A second generation of vases is now underway, including one for peace in Korea. And last year, as steward for this earth treasure vase for peace with Russia to go to the Bering Strait, I learned that a steward was being searched for and needed for the Korea vase. And when I heard this, I didn't know Christine, but I knew of her. And I couldn't think of anyone better than you, Christine, to be a steward. And when we finally met, I asked you if you would be willing, and you embraced this stewardship with all of your heart. And so I just wanted to invite you to share in your heart what you are doing with this vase, and also if you could share your dream, because when I heard your dream, and those of us in the Steward Council heard your dream that you had many years ago, it somehow feels connected with this vase. So welcome you now to share what's in your heart about this.
Thank you, Cynthia, and Cynthia, yours, and Elizabeth, Christine. It's I'm very honored that you would give such a huge responsibility to someone like me to take this. Here it is, right here. This is the Earth Treasure vase that I hope to carry with me to Korea, hopefully to the DMZ. There's already a place that I'm thinking about in Charwan, which is on the southern side. Charwan is actually one of the provinces that is divided. Actually, there is the northern part and the southern part, but before obviously Korea's division, it was just Charwan. So just my dream really briefly, and sorry to all the people that have heard it a million times, Kalama, Jess. But gosh, I think it was in 2009, I was working at the Global Fund for Women. As I mentioned, like 2 of my life work has been for women and gender equality. And the other is, moonlighting as a peace activist for Korea. And we had just screened the film, Pray the Devil Back to Hell, which is the extraordinary work of Liberian women crossing religious lines to bring an end to the civil conflict, 17-year-old conflict in Liberia. And that documentary film just so profoundly moved me that actually this idea of women and peace building came to me in the form of a dream. I woke up in the middle of the night, literally, and I turned on my computer, and on the home screen was of the New York Times was a story about the flooding of the Indian River, which is the river that flows through the heart of the Korean Peninsula. And it was flooding in the north, and North Korea allegedly lifted the floodgates without telling South Korea. The hotline between North and South was shut off at the time. It was Kim Jong-il in the north, and then in the south was Lee Myung-bak, who was a former Hyundai executive, and those 2 men weren't talking. And because of the floodgates being lifted, several South Koreans died, including a father and a son who were fishing in the early morning. And I remember just reading that story and just thinking, how is this tragedy still happening? How are people still dying today because of this unresolved conflict? And that's when I went back to sleep, and that's when I had this extraordinary dream where I was wading in the river, and I was with others, wondering if people were going to come. And it was like right before the the cusp of dawn, and this light started to come down the river, and it was this glow of these candles that and it just like flowed down the river, and then that light morphed into family reunions. Many of you may have seen, when elderly Koreans, siblings who haven't seen each other since they were 8, 9 years old, now they're in their 70s, 80s, and just that embrace of divided families just was so moving. But maybe it's because I'm on the diaspora, I just felt compelled to keep up the river to find the source of the light. And that's when I came upon a circle of women, and they were stirring something that then they poured into little vessels that then flowed down the river. And I remember waking up at that moment and saying, I know who will end the war. Women will end the war. And my husband at the time was like, what, are you crazy? And I was like, yeah, I know, like, how are we gonna end the war? And I did some research, and in fact, this year is the 30th anniversary of the first meeting of North and South Korean women, organized by a Japanese member of the Diet. She had contacts with the Communist Party in the DPRK, and the first meeting was actually convened. And actually, Hejung Park, who is on the call here, who was really my right-hand woman in organizing this crossing, helped me gather all these incredible oral histories, especially South Korean women who have done the hard work of how do you meet when you have the most militarized border in the world. And so we gathered these stories, and that's how we began this journey. Like we have, especially in times of impasse between North Korea, the international community has a role to play. The international community has a role to play because Korea was divided by Cold War powers. The Korean War involved 21 countries. It wasn't just a war between North and South Korea. It was an international war. It was the front end of the Cold War. And the Korea inaugurated the military industrial complex in the US. It quadrupled defense spending in just 3 years. And it set forth the US to become the world's military police. It's not just a symbolic act of ending the Korean War. It's about transforming how we in the United States can actually live with greater peace, greater security, and not be have the militarized foreign policy around the world. So that's part of the dream, part of the vision, and I'm deeply honored that you've endowed me with this blessing to carry this earth vase to Korea, to be part of this big global effort to bring healing and peace to the people, and to especially the Korean people.
Christine, it's our honor and our blessing that you're doing this. And I just want to let everyone know that every month on the full moon, people all around the world gather for an Earth Treasure Vase meditation. And next month on July 23rd, full moon, Christine will open the Korea vase for the first time in ceremony to receive prayers and offerings. And we welcome you all to join us in sharing your prayers and offerings. At that time, we're putting the Zoom registration link in the chat, along with other Earth Treasure Vase links for you to learn more about it if you're interested. And I also want to, at this point, bring our circle to a close. And I want to thank you all who have joined us from all over the world, and a special thanks to our remarkable mentors, Christine, Jessica, and Kalama, for all the sharing of your insights and wisdom, for all the light that you shined for peace. To Tom Dawson, our wonderful tech session operator, and to Colleen Moore, who's been live tweeting and sharing on Instagram throughout the session. and for all of your wonderful postings. And also to you, Auntie Puna, Kumu, Hula, Puna, Dawson, for your beautiful opening blessing. And Auntie is going to close our circle with a blessing in a moment. I just have a few announcements before we close. Our next session will be on Monday, July 26th, Strategies for Restorative Justice, Banning Nuclear Testing and Remembering Trinity, featuring Tina Cordova, Lily Adams, and others who are working so courageously on this issue. And the link for that registration is going into the chat now as well. Also a link to learn more about and for our mentors on our recommended resource page that has all kinds of articles and videos that the mentors have shared and done. And finally, I want to invite you all to watch our recordings for the exciting dialogues we've been running alongside this, initiated by this project with Russian American women, viewing our open letter to Presidents Biden and Putin, which was published in papers like the Washington Post on the eve of the summit, in which we called on them to affirm the principle a nuclear war cannot be won and never be fought, as many others did. And we're so grateful that they actually did this as a very first step to eliminating nuclear weapons, and may it be the first of many steps leading to the global elimination of nuclear weapons everywhere. So we're putting those links into the chat for you as well. And now, Auntie Puna, I'd love for you to close our sacred circle today, still in the light of solstice, with a closing blessing. And again, thank you so much all for coming. Really grateful for your being here.
Aloha, everyone. Again, today has been such an inspiration of truth. Mahalo for being, all of you, for being who you are and saying such important things for all of us to remember how important our world is and what a difference we can make just by taking the time to listen. Like our queen, I want to reiterate her thoughts. We are one people, one earth. We live in this ocean of time. And from moment to moment, we have an opportunity to be part of the solution. And so she says, Ho'okahi puana, let us be one people. Ho'opu'uhai, people of the heart. Ikapo'e I aloha, let us be the people who come together in truth and righteousness, in love. Ikalahui, one world, one intention, one aloha. Aloha, everyone. Breath, aloha. Ahui ho. Mahalo.
Mahalo, Auntie. Mahalo, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. May all the visions and dreams for peace come true. Mahalo, aloha.
Thank you, Cynthia. Aloha.
Thank you, Christine. Thank you, Kalama. Thank you, Jess. Thank you, everyone.